We will start out by acknowledging that those at our Chathiara campus in Fairbanks are on the unceded customary lands of the Dana people of the Tanana River. In Nome, we are on Inupiaq, Iñupiaq, and Siberian Yupik lands. We honor the continued fight for the rights of First Peoples and stand together in solidarity and action. At UAF, we are growing into a socially just and caring institution of higher education. This ongoing speaker series titled Shine a Light, Promoting Conversations on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion is designed to encourage understanding, build empathy, and engage us in thinking critically about our worldviews. This series is led by the Northwest Campus, but like all great diversity efforts, there are many partnerships and collaborations. I would like to thank UAF's Department of Equity and Compliance and Nanook Diversity and Action Center for partnering with the Northwest Campus to bring this series to reality. You can find the recordings of past presentations on the Northwest Campus's website under the Outreach tab. This link will be added to the chat. This semester, our Shine a Light events are during the noon hour of each third Tuesday of the month. Again, thank you for being here today, and we hope you continue to join us. I would now like to introduce and thank our speaker, Jenny Irene Miller, for today's presentation on art as storytelling. Artist Jenny Irene Miller is Inupiaq and is originally from Nome, Alaska. They work primarily with photography, but also sometimes video, sound, and sculpture. Grounded in storytelling, Miller explores the intersection of her identities, from her queerness to their Inupiaq identity, and familial and community relations. Her work also examines knowledge of self, place, and ways of knowing. They are inspired by kinship, home, and our stories. Please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that Jenny may address at the end of their presentation. And you are more than welcome to use the chat feature, but please make sure to put your questions in the Q&A feature so we don't miss them. Thanks, everyone. And at this time, I will turn it over to Jenny.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Casey. Thank you for being here and for sharing your time with me today. Thank you to the University of Alaska Fairbanks Northwest Campus for inviting me to share this talk as part of their Shine a Light series. As Casey shared, my name is Jenny, and I'm an artist who works primarily with the medium of photography. I also use video and sound in my art practice when needed, and I have also begun to explore the medium of sculpture here and there. Today's talk will include a brief overview of a selection of past work and current work, and an introduction to who I am and where I come from. My work and this talk is grounded in using art as a storytelling method. The circumpolar region is what we Inuit call home. We continue to live in our homelands in the empires of the United States, in Alaska, Canada, Greenland, Russia, and beyond. I'm from Nome and come from the Inupiaq of Northwest Alaska. And as you can see in the bottom left, there's Nome, and then the larger map of Alaska to the right, which many of us are familiar with, as I saw on the participants list, a lot of folks from Alaska are there. This map illustrates the many Indigenous place names that the previous map does not include. This region was and is still home to many unique Alaska Native peoples. I like to start all of my talks with a recognition of place and where I come from. Place plays an important role in who I am and what my work is about. If I could boil down my work to one word, it would be home. Home is made up of community, family, non-human kin, and so much more. It's important for me to ground my viewers and audience in where I come from, so perhaps those viewers who are not part of my culture may look at my work with a more informed perspective to critically analyze the work. I see my work as a form of visual sovereignty. Visual sovereignty, as Dr. Jolene Rickard says, and I quote, is one of the most dominant expressions of self-determination. Just as my Inupiaq ancestors' identities were formed, my identity is shaped by the lands and the waters that we come from. I am King Iñupiaq, which translates to the people of Kinigan. Who I am is formed by my relations to kin, to the land, the ocean, my family, the community I come from, and those who I love. This photograph is an image I made during my first visit to Kinigan, the village of my maternal family roots. It is 109 miles northwest of Nome. My fascination with the photograph began at a young age. In 1994, at the age of 6, after my great-grandma passed away, I inherited her Polaroid camera. This was when I began to form a strong interest in looking at photographs and making snapshot images of the people and places in my life, as well as the mundane activities I deemed important as a child. It was also around this time that my enchantment with our family's archive began. I see photography as a magic medium. Photography as a medium still has that magical quality to it that draws me in and allows me to spend more time with a particular subject, theme, or memory. Photography provides a space for me to practice a form of careful observation that runs deep in the Inupiaq culture that I come from. These images are my first self-portraits from 1996, made with the help of my brother, who I directed to click the shutter. It's a silly story of taking a bath and getting ready for bed made by kids. The next slides contain a selection of work I made during my last couple of years of undergrad at the University of Washington. This work is called The Duwamish River and was made in 2011 on the land and waters of the Duwamish peoples, the original peoples of Seattle. As an Inupiaq person, I come from water peoples. So everywhere I live, I'm looking for the water, observing the water, and trying to learn more about it. These images portray the natural yet urban environment, industry, and restoration areas of the river and snippets of the surrounding neighborhood. While living in Seattle, I was learning more about the Duwamish River and first came to know this river by following it from the headwaters in the mountains to the tidewaters. At that time, since I only used public transportation and a bike to get around, I couldn't travel again to the headwaters after that initial visit. I then decided to spend more time at the tidewaters of the Duwamish River and make images there, as well as on the river itself. Today, the Duwamish River is much different than what it used to be. The once meandering river was altered and straightened in 1913 by the Army Corps of Engineers. The natural channels were modified for a deeper, straighter body of water to enable ships to steer through, allowing industry to drastically alter this river. In 2001, the Duwamish River was listed as a federal Superfund site. A conversation with me in Inupiaq from 2013 comments on language suppression through external forces organized by the US federal government, such as missionaries, boarding schools, and other assimilation tactics. In this video, which is normally projected life-size on a wall, I remain silent because I cannot speak my language. It is also shot in a church as Christianity has played a significant role in the suppression of our language. Language still plays a role in the work I am making today through titles or thinking about the visual language of photography or my attempts to include my own voice through handwriting, which we will see later. That's Not Quack, How Did We Get Here is a 3-channel video. When making this piece, I was interested in food sovereignty and how our Inupiaq identity is tied to our foods, the lands, and the waters our food comes from. Around this time, I was thinking about my own relationship to traditional foods such as maktab seal and other forms of quack, and how I wasn't able to access that food when I was away from my home community, and how my tastes were changing as I moved further and further away from Northwest Alaska. This video is also the first piece where I began to experiment with visual cues that perhaps many Inupiaq people would recognize and relate to. That is the dull and mass-produced ulu my cousin cuts the chicken with, and the cardboard she cuts the chicken on. Cardboard, which we use back home to cut our foods on, which are often sea mammals, can be too large for a normal cutting board, and the mammals have strong scents. Therefore, cardboard provides the cutting board that can easily be disposed of. This is also the first time I began to experiment with the concept of learning through observation, which is culturally significant. As Inupiaq, we are taught to learn from watching and learn by doing. Taking this customary act of learning through observation, my cousin Andy Faye viewed a video on YouTube on how to cut a chicken. She then portioned out the whole $6.99 rotisserie chicken for us to eat, using a mass-produced ulu not made by our peoples, a mimic of a traditional Inuit knife. That's Not Quack, How Did We Get Here comments on the switch from nutrient-rich traditional foods to easy-to-access store-bought foods. Our traditional foods are integral to our culture and identity. Food defines who we are and connects us to our ancestors. So how did we get here? Continuous is a project that I started in 2015 after wanting to see more Indigenous queer representation that was made by us and featured us, and my desire to connect with other queer Native folks. During this time, I was also thinking a lot about my own story in youth and how I wish I would have had an Indigenous queer adult to reach out to talk to, and connect with as a person coming to know myself as queer. Continuous features portraits of Indigenous LGBTQ2+ peoples, which are accompanied by short stories from each participant. This project ranged from 2015 to 2018. Continuous centers Indigenous queer peoples in our stories and acknowledges that heteropatriarchy and heteronormativity are part of the colonial project and the US empire. This is an example of one story which Mariah shared. I've known Mariah since childhood, so it was incredibly special to have her as part of this work, as well as others featured in this project. My hope is that Continuous will continue to inspire dialogue within our communities so that they can become more welcoming and safe for our Indigenous queer kin to flourish. Back in 2019, I collaborated with the Alaska Humanities Forum to create a conversational toolkit as part of their Kindling Conversation program called Continuous Conversations, which is inspired by my work Continuous and the stories shared by each person featured in my portrait series. The forum's Kindling Conversation program was built to help folks do just that, host a conversation. So it provides themed toolkits, host support, and $250 of funding to Alaskans interested in hosting short, thoughtful community conversations tailored to connect people across difference and foster inclusive conversational spaces throughout the state. Alaska Humanities Forum's website has more information on those interested if you want to host continuous conversations in your community. Also, if you're interested in this work, a selection of the portraits and stories can be found on my website at jennyirenemiller.com. So now moving forward to more recent work. These are a few of the last images I got to make with my mom prior to leaving Alaska for graduate school in 2019. Over the years, and really since high school, I've always made portraits of my mom. This session was especially tender and hard. It was tough to leave Alaska knowing my mom had an aggressive form of cancer and would be going into her last round of chemotherapy while my partner and I and our dog made our drive from Anchorage to Albuquerque. My mom is cancer-free today, and we both look back at these images as visual references of strength and what she has overcome. Being new to Albuquerque and far from home in 2019 and not having a community there caused me to think hard, and it took me a while to make work that became something. So I began to think about how to bring stories from home forward in new work while not having immediate access to home or community. This caused me to explore other modes of making, such as sculpture. My Grammy's Dialect working title from 2019 is a small-scale sculpture carved from ivory brand soap in the form of a human tongue that comes out of the wall at roughly the height my late grandma would have been when she was abused in school for speaking her language. While I was in elementary school, Inupiaq master carvers were invited to our school to teach us about the medium of walrus tusk carving. Because ivory soap is much more affordable and accessible than walrus ivory, we were taught to carve soap to mimic the tradition of ivory carving. My Grammy's dialect references one means by which the Inupiaq language has been suppressed in Inupiaq communities, as well as other Indigenous communities, through the washing of one's mouth with soap for speaking their dialect. Thinking about language and having conversations with kin who have passed through my work continues to come forward. This image, looking for my language in the corner where my Grammy was forced to leave it, was made in 2019. I was never satisfied with this image, no matter how many times I tried to remake it. It remains a sketch. Since that previous image never felt quite finished, I returned to the space of the corner this last fall, fall 2021. This iteration of working in the corner references my view of home, of personal memories of my great-grandma's living room and so many homes in Northwest Alaska through the layout of the works. I've been thinking about how many photographs of loved ones were displayed on the walls of elders' home in Alaska. Frames of all sizes graced the walls featuring kin. Portraits were layered through small acts of safekeeping by tucking frameless photographs into the corners of the frame where the glass and wood met. This work in progress is inspired by those modest yet significant gestures of keeping loved ones close, as I remember from childhood. I've obscured some of the faces in the archival images as an act of protection, similar to my other work. This idea of activating the corner and it being a site of coming together is of interest to me. It's a space I have been thinking about since 2019. The corner can also reference a triangle, which is another coded visual language found in our tattooing. At the time of making this, I was still navigating this mode of working and what this piece would become, or what works this mode of production can and will transform into. I found a solution, which is a new sculpture piece I made this year out of my late great-grandma's handwriting, which was part of my MFA thesis work, Where the Tundra Meets the Ocean. And before I get into talking about where the tundra meets the ocean, I want to talk about this photo. This image has been an important reference point for me in my current art practice. My great-grandma's fancy fur parka found in our family photographs contains layers of information beyond a simple and uninformed read of the garment. Our Inupiaq clothing includes signals and information about the wearer through pattern cut and abstract designs that silently communicate who they are, their gender, and what community they are of. Today, these designs remind us of who we come from. Our clothing is tied to place. And our clothing has also been used for protection from the harsh climate we come from. I've been trying to figure out how to incorporate our abstract designs that are thousands of years old into my work, and to translate this idea of protection in a new way. I see this notion of protection showing up in my work in the form of refusal. To refuse is to exercise extraordinary power. I do this because as an Inupiaq person, many of our stories have been told by people outside of our communities, which can be dangerous. In that process, our stories have become disconnected from us and do not represent me. They exist as stereotypes and remain in the past. I've been thinking about the power I hold as an artist, especially when photo-based works are created, and how much information I choose to give the viewer and how much to keep for myself. And I am thinking about how the refusal of information can, when I feel it is necessary, protect the person or non-human kin being photographed or visualized. When employed, this strategy can enact a form of tension. It requires a close read of the work. Ultimately, who has access to all of that information? And what does that refusal do to the viewer? Does it cause discomfort or curiosity? During the time of making this video, I was reading work by Deborah Bird and thinking about Indigenous refusal. As Deborah Bird has highlighted, and I quote, "To get in the way of settler colonization, all the Native person has to do is stay home," end of quote. What I learned from Bird and other Indigenous scholars is that Indigenous peoples, and specifically queer Indigenous folks, are a threat to the empire simply through our existence. This threat is found within our refusal of the US empire's queerphobic, transphobic, and patriarchal principles. Standing our ground and taking up space as Indigenous peoples gets in the way of settler colonialism and is Indigenous refusal. Indigenous refusal has become an important theory to my work. In Self-Portrait Legs 2020, I've directed the focus of my lens onto myself again. This self-portrait is about queerness and my identity as a whole. While making this image, I was thinking about the following. What does it mean to be feminine? What does it mean to be masculine? What about a little bit of both? Who gets to decide? This piece utilizes deadpan humor and pokes fun of the pervasive standards of mainstream American culture. Cleanliness and beauty, the dangers of a gender binary, and made up rules around who should and should not shave their legs. Untitled 2020 is a standalone piece from a stage in my practice where I began to experiment with language in a new way to me through the inclusion of handwritten text. This photograph is also a way to celebrate the closed practice of Inuit tattooing, the artists found back home who have given me these tattoos, and the artists who have made the pieces of jewelry that I choose to adorn myself with. In April 2021, I was finally able to go back home for the first time since leaving for grad school in 2019 due to the pandemic. During that visit, I got to visit with my mom and my auntie. And during that time, I made many images of both of them. And I also made images of my mom's scars from her chemotherapy port, scans of the port, and began to think more about my family's archive and how those images from the past act as portals and connect me to my kin who have passed through space and time. During that visit, I spent late nights scanning images, documents, and objects. I'm still figuring out this work specifically that's beginning to tell the story of my mom's cancer battle. I feel it's an important story to place in this ever-growing archive I'm adding to with my work for future Inupiaq to look at. This piece is the scan of an archival family photograph with my aka's handwritten note, also made during the same time of the images from the previous slides. This image speaks to love, care, to what is not only inside of the frame, but what is outside of the frame. While reading this note, I felt the love my late great-grandparents shared for each other. I also felt sadness, but above all, I felt a connection to my great-grandparents more through this note than what was on the reverse side. I've been thinking about access and the access one has to information, to histories, to stories in my work. And I have been thinking about the unseen in this piece. This note can have multiple reads. I feel the sense of love and pride. Willie, a skilled hunter and provider, presented his wife Helen with the new fur. Helen was a skilled skin sewer and seamstress. This Wolverine was most likely turned into the sunshine ruff on her fancy fur parka found in the archival photographs. Sunshine ruffs are a staple in Inupiaq parka making. This reading of mine differs from even a read I had by another person who could only focus initially on the word killed in the note. This piece is about tender love, and those who come from my community will recognize this. This brings me to my current work and work that was part of my MFA thesis. Where the Tundra Meets the Ocean renders family through photographs and the reactivation of family archival images and documents. This ongoing work centers on Inupiaq and queer quiet moments and memories, an intergenerational dialogue between myself, family members, and those who have passed. This work features the strong women in my life, soft moments found at home with my partner, and the spaces and memories where I find comfort. These photographs help me keep those in my family who have passed alive and my kin nearby. Moments highlighted in Where the Tundra Meets the Ocean, such as in this photograph, Tea with Aka, which I actually recently renamed Tea with Aka in parentheses, remembering her, presents a conversation I am having with my late great-grandma over tea. The photograph features her teacup and saucer. Through objects such as the teacup, and by including myself through the shadow of the hand, this story serves as an act of remembering her. This process also allows me to keep her close to me and not forgotten. In my art practice, I have been asking myself, how do I keep someone alive who has passed on, and how do I make photographs of them? Working with my family archive and building my personal archive is a form of visual remembrance and directly links the past to the future. It is a way for me to share traces of my family legacies. Inupiaq use oral storytelling to impart knowledge, share lessons, and keep one another alive. Native feminism also teaches us that storytelling and the act of remembering can serve as methods to keep people who no longer exist in this realm alive. My work aligns with these concepts. And also, because there's some Inupiaq people in the audience, I do want to acknowledge that I call my late great grandma Aka because she did raise my mom, so I grew up knowing her as Aka. The color palette in my work relates to home, to Northwest Alaska. While a good portion of these images were made in Alaska, a good number were also made in New Mexico and beyond. The pandemic kept me from returning home as much as I would have liked during graduate school, but I found it a great challenge to make work about home while living away. The sometimes soft light renders the subject matter in a similar quality of light that would be found in Alaska during the winter months. The energetic light in others could be found on a summer day where the midnight sun shines intensely. Where the Tundra Meets the Ocean contains poetic whispers of kinship, which ask the viewers to slow down to engage with the stillness in the photographs. The viewing of this work is not to be rushed, which relates to Inupiaq concepts of time, observation as a key learning method, and the value of patience in my culture. In this image, my mom holds an archival photograph that features my late Aka and my late Grammy. This image is about generational strength, love, and Indigenous joy. Again, in this work, I wanted to include important family members who have passed on. For the past 10 years plus, I've had so many questions I've wanted to ask my late great grandma and late grandma. This archival image is one small way for me to remain with them. To me, that's another great quality of photography. It keeps us connected to kin. Where the Tundra Meets the Ocean is a space I've been thinking about in my practice, especially since the pandemic started and returning home was more difficult while living in New Mexico. It's a place I've been traveling to through my work and family archival photographs and documents. The following slides feature documentation photographs of my most recent sequence of Where the Tundra Meets the Ocean, which exhibited at the John Summers Gallery in Albuquerque of April 2022. I chose to print my photographs larger than I normally do because I want my work to take up space, to center Inupiaq and queer stories. Each of the 48 by 32 images contain one small hand-drawn unique design that is relevant to my culture. These abstract designs are simple at first glance, yet contain layers of information and are thousands of years old. Our Inupiaq ancestors adorned almost everything they made, from clothing to hunting devices, with designs. Again, these abstract designs silently communicate who and where someone comes from. Our designs can also mark important milestones in one's life. I wanted to make my own frames from scratch so that I could etch designs into the frames as an act of protection, adornment, and for the visual symbols to act as small gifts to those who look. Each design is specific to the image it corresponds to. This piece came to life from me continuing to think about that space of the corner, which I referred to earlier in this talk, of language and how to reclaim that space that I was originally looking at as a space of language loss. Here, my great-grandma's handwriting and note detail from 1989 activates the corner. Her story continues with me and my work, and those who are also connected to her. To me, the sheet metal references the graphite of the pencil she originally used to write this story down with. The interconnectedness of the photographs I have made and the reactivation of the family archive thread us together and visually presents closeness in a larger conversation between my loved ones and I. This work highlights intergenerational sharing of knowledge, of history, of identity. I also made this photo book, which contains the larger sequence of this work to accompany my thesis exhibition. The photo book contains 38 photographs, has 78 pages total, and is about 10.5 by 8 inches. An addition of 75 were printed this year. Okay, thank you for sharing your time with me today. And at this moment, we have some time for a short Q&A. And again, to see more of my work, please visit my website at jennyirenemiller.com. I'm also on Instagram if you'd like to follow me. My handle is Jenny Irene Miller. Thanks again for your time, and I'm looking forward to some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jenny. This was awesome. I have a question here for you. Was there anything particularly surprising that you learned when connecting with other queer Indigenous folks during the creation of Continuous?
What was the first part of that question?
If there was anything particularly surprising that you learned during the process, like from their stories and making those photos.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that question. I guess what really stood out to me was how much almost all of us, um, if not the majority of folks in that work, felt alone and like they were possibly the only queer Native person in their community. So it was that kind of stood out to me and really made me realize how important it is for us to come together as community members, and how beautiful it was to be able to hear each other's stories and to be making this work. And really, I see that project, that body of work as being a celebration, but also it's now within that queer Native archive for future queer Native folks and um, non-queer folks, non-Native folks to look to and to learn from.
Thanks. We have another one here about refusal. You spoke about, queer Indigenous folks just existing as a threat to the US empire's queerphobic and patriarchal principles. When did you first realize that?
Oh, so I came to that acknowledgement I think it was in fall of 2021 after reading a lot of work by Deborah Bird and different Indigenous scholars, such as one of my mentors at University of New Mexico, Jennifer Dennett Dale. Just reading this work and thinking about how much the US empire, it has this certain erasure of queer peoples, trans folks, and us existing as who we are is a threat to that because we were supposed to be erased. We're not part of that narrative. So taking up space, sharing our story, for those of us who have the privilege and the safety to be out, where we can also be inspiration for other folks who feel like they're alone, kind of like what I was just referencing. But also like we're in a really scary time in history right now because a lot of queer folks and queer establishments are being targeted, as we saw with the recent mass shooting of Club Q, and so it is really a privilege for myself to be out and to be making work about myself and queerness and featuring other queer folks who give me the privilege to feature them in my work.
Someone asked, what is quack?
Quack is like frozen meat, frozen raw meat. You could eat quack as we had back home would be like frozen raw fish.
Someone commented, I just want to say thank you, Jenny. I loved your presentation and beautiful artwork.
Thank you.
Another question, what does taking up space mean to you? You provided us with some examples within your work, but I just wanted to know like your definition, how you operate.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Taking up space to me in my art practice is, taking up that gallery space that is traditionally a space that Native and queer folks weren't part of. So putting my work into these establishments and having it feature Indigenous and queer stories is taking up that space. So from some of the examples that I shared, especially with where the tundra meets the ocean, some of my photographs are printed much larger than I usually print them. They were 48 by 32 inches. So also physically taking up space with my work and hoping that those stories will be viewed and acknowledged, but also like taking up space within institutions, sharing artist talks, making work about community, myself, and hopefully inspiring younger queer and Indigenous artists to continue with their practice, and hopefully then they'll take up this space, and we'll make room for others. I hope that answers your question.
It does, thank you. Someone asks, have you had any interest or surprising response to your work from the Inupiaq community specifically? Interesting or surprising?
That's a hard question to answer, because I've had different reactions to different pieces from like my closer Inupiaq, the folks who are also identify as Inupiaq and queer. I've had, it's been very welcoming and supportive. Responses have come from that community, from family members. Of course, my mom and my auntie have been some of my #1 cheerleaders since I was younger. But that's a hard question to answer, because I feel like I've been really supported from different folks. And, initially, Dr. Barb Amarok reaching out and inviting me to give this talk, that's a huge support and recognition. So I'm grateful for her support and other folks who have known me since I was a child, and just providing these spaces to share more of my work feels like great support.
Someone says, thank you. I love your presentation artwork. This was truly sacred.
Thank you.
Another comment, I love how you interweave identity, culture, and language. Learned a lot here, such as about the stories from the abstract designs. Language was represented through powerful images and how stories are changed as they are told by outsiders.
Thank you.
Along the lines of taking up space, what advice do you have for other marginalized folks who want to take up space but aren't really sure what that might look like for them? Like you brought up taking up physical space and getting FaceTime and recognition within spaces, but beyond that, do you have any advice?
Yeah. That's a really wonderful question. I really appreciate that question. I would say, one, if you are an artist, whatever form of art you work on, whether it be a written word, sound, visual, continue to make that art and connect with other folks to share it. And even that's kind of taking up space, but also just existing and being who you are, and being feeling comfortable as who you are is really important. And really, I think it's community, connecting with community, even finding, in the queer community, we call it chosen family. So finding folks who you can connect with, taking up space. That's, going back to what Deborah Bird has said, is just like simply existing, and not erasing parts of yourself to fit into different spaces. I know sometimes as a queer person that's hard, because there's a lot of folks who simply don't want us to exist. So just knowing that you are important, and being who you are is it's an incredible gift.
Thank you. Do we have any final questions for Jenny? Wait a few moments. Are there any final words you want to leave us with, Jenny, before we close this out?
Yeah, sure. Thanks everyone again for attending. It was really grateful to be able to share my work with you all, and thank you to Laura and thank you, Casey, for hosting me today.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Please keep an eye out for upcoming Shine a Light presentations at nwc.uaf.edu or on Facebook, so facebook.com/uaf.nwc. If you'd like to share the recording or give feedback, you can do so by visiting the Outreach tab on the Northwest Campus website. We will now be closing the webinar. Have a great day, everyone.